For 70 years, The Honeymooners was called one of the greatest shows ever made. Every Saturday night, America laughed as Ralph Creighton waved his fist and threatened to send Alice to the moon. "You are a flyer." Screaming, a studio audience of 1,000 people would roar at lines that today would never make it to air. "You see there, boy. Will you stop that? I got a splitting headache." "Yeah. All right." But there was one moment in 1955 that crossed a line nobody talked about for decades. A scene so uncomfortable, music, that it was quietly pulled from circulation. What Jackie Gleason actually did that night and why, music, CBS spent years pretending it never happened, is finally being told. The Honeymooners did not start as a full sitcom. It started as a very short sketch. On October 5, 1951, a 6-minute and 38-second segment aired on the Dumont television network during Cavalcade of Stars. The variety show Jackie Gleason had been hosting since the summer of 1950. The setup was simple. A bus driver named Ralph Creighton and his wife Alice fought in a small, worn-out apartment, and they fought in a way that felt harsh, funny, and painfully real all at once. There was no Ed Norton yet. Music. In that first sketch, Art Carney showed up only as a policeman who happened to pass by and got hit on the head by something Alice threw out the window. That first version already revealed what made the idea stand out. It was built on pressure inside a marriage. Sharp words, old frustrations, and the sense that the walls were always closing. Music. In the early sketch was described by television historians as a scene of marital combat, and the word fits. The version people remember now often softens music at beginning. Yet the truth is harder and more interesting. The Honeymooners came out of kitchen sink comedy where anger, embarrassment, and the threat of things getting out of hand were part of the joke. Viewers recognized something familiar in that mess right away. Because of that response, writers Harry Crane and Joe Bigelow were brought in to build it into something bigger. New characters came in. The Nortons were added. Trixie First was played by Elaine Stretch, not Joyce Randolph. As the months passed, the sketches became longer and more developed, with some running half an hour and some stretching even further. By the time Gleason left Dumont and moved to CBS, the material already had momentum. William Paley, who ran CBS, brought him over for the Jackie Gleason Show, a large live variety program that began on Saturday nights in 1952. The Honeymooners sketches became one of its strongest attractions, and the ratings climbed, music, fast. Even then, the Creightons were only one part of Gleason's world. On the variety show, he moved through a whole lineup of characters, including Reginald Van Gleason III, the poor soul, Joe the bartender, and loudmouth Charlie Bratton. Clear's throat, he opened with the June Taylor Dancers, greeted the audience with How Sweet It Is, and closed with And Way We Go. He had the size of a heavyweight and the timing of a dancer, and that music mix made him impossible to ignore. Still, among all those pieces, the Honeymooners kept growing until it became too big to remain music, just a segment. That is why CBS and Gleason finally spun it off into its own film series. In that sense, it became one of television's earliest true spin-offs. The reason it struck such a nerve had a lot to do with where it came from. Ralph Creighton lived at 358 Shandy Street. And that address was not random. It was Gleason's own childhood address in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Ralph's bluster, his endless plans to get rich, and his fury at a life that kept him stuck were all drawn from something Gleason knew for himself. He was born Herbert Walton Gleason Jr. on February 26, 1916. His older brother Clement died of meningitis when Jackie was still a small boy. Then in 1925, his father walked out and never returned. That left Gleason and his mother with no steady income and no easy way forward. He learned a lot of what he knew in Brooklyn pool halls. And years later, that same world helped him play Minnesota Fats in The Hustler. So when Ralph Crampton raged against bad luck, small paychecks, and dashed hopes, it did not feel invented. It felt remembered. Music. In 1955, Gleason wanted a break from the weekly strain of live variety television, but he still agreed to continue with The Honeymooners as a filmed half-hour series. The new version premiered on October 1, 1955, and those episodes became the group now known as the Classic 39. Their survival is part of the reason the show still feels alive. They were shot with Dumont's electronic music system, which used film cameras alongside the live performance. They were filmed in front of a studio audience of about 1,000 people at the Adelphi Theater on West 54th Street in Manhattan. That audience matters. Their laughter was real. The pauses were real. And the energy in the room gave the scenes their snap. A huge amount of early television vanished because it was either never preserved or survived only through blurry kinescopes made by filming a screen. The Classic 39 were captured on actual film, which is why they still look so clear decades later. That fact carries a strange twist. The season that made the show immortal was also the one recorded in a way that could truly last. While many earlier live sketches, music, sometimes looser and even funnier, faded away or survive only in weak copies, there were other details in that 1955 season that people often miss. Gleason wrote the show's theme, "You're My Greatest Love," though many viewers never knew it had lyrics. Even more surprising, the film version did not arrive with universal praise. Music, the reviews at the time were mixed, and the near-sacred reputation the show has now came later through syndication and memory. At its core, the setup, music, stayed beautifully simple. Ralph Crampton, played by Gleason, drove a bus for the Gotham Bus Company and dreamed of a life far above the one he had. His music, best friend and upstairs neighbor, Ed Norton, played by Art Carney, music, worked in the sewers, and happily followed Ralph into one bad plan after another. They tried to sell gadgets on television, chased wild business ideas, and poured hope into schemes that never had much chance. The two were also part of the International Order of Friendly Sons of Music, the raccoons with its funny hats and lodge rituals, and they bowled together. Alice, played by Audrey Meadows, saw disaster coming almost every time, and usually turned out to be right. Trixie, played by Joyce Randolph, stood with her. The Creighton's apartment was famously bare. There was a battered table, music, an icebox, a window facing an air shaft, and very little else. That choice mattered because most television in the 1950s was full of bright suburban comfort. The Honeymooners looked poorer, tighter, and more honest. Then, after Ralph's latest plan came apart, the show often ended with a softer note. Music, he would pull Alice close and tell her, "Baby, you're the greatest." That line helped hold the whole thing together. Of course, most people remember the show first through its lines. "One of these days, Alice. One of these days, pow. Right in the kisser. To the moon. Alice. Music, bang. Zoom. Ralph's panicked. Humina. 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 When he had no way out of a lie. Gleason's own. And away we go. Those phrases, music, stayed alive long after the original run ended, and they also lead straight into the part of the show's history that feels more surprising once you look closer. One of the most unsettling truths involves Herc Kelton, the first Alice. She was born in 1907 in Great Falls, Montana, and she was already an experienced performer when she took the role in the earliest Honeymooner sketches. Many people who saw her believed she was the most believable Alice of them all. She had a rougher edge, a harder voice, and she matched, music, Gleason's Ralph in a way that felt very natural. Yet, when the show moved to CBS, she did not go with it. And the reason had little to do with acting. Kelton's husband, music, actor Ralph Bell, had once sponsored an advertisement in the Daily Worker, a communist newspaper back in 1948. During the McCarthy era, both Bell and Kelton were named in Red Channels, the 1950 pamphlet that helped destroy careers by marking performers as communist sympathizers or associates. In that climate, association alone could be enough. Kelton was pushed off the show. Gleason objected, but it changed nothing. The public was given a cover story about heart trouble, though the real cause was the blacklist. Her television career was badly damaged because of a political panic, music, and the show simply moved forward without her. Later, Kelton rebuilt, music, some of her career on Broadway and became well known for originating Mrs. Peru in The Music Man in 1957 before repeating the role in the 1962 film version. There was something quietly moving in what happened near the end of her life. She returned to Gleason's world in the late 1960s and played Alice's mother, not Alice herself. She died in 1968. Much of her work as the original Alice survives only in scattered and hard-to-find recordings, which gives her place in television history an oddly ghostly quality. One of the first memorable wives on television was pushed out by fear and politics, and many people barely know it happened. Then Audrey Meadows stepped in, and the way she got the role sounds almost like a scene from a film. Meadows was born on February 8, 1922 in Wuchang, China. Her parents were Episcopal missionaries, and she was also the sister of actress Jane Meadows. By the time she auditioned for Alice, she looked polished and glamorous. Music, and Gleason took one look at her and decided she did not fit. He thought she looked too young and too pretty to play the tired wife of a Brooklyn bus driver. Instead of arguing, Meadows went home, took off her makeup, changed her hair, put on a plain house dress, and arranged for a photographer to shoot a deliberately plain set of pictures. She sent those pictures to Gleason. He loved the look and reportedly was amazed when he found out it was the same actress he had rejected just before. That move won her the part, and she later won an Emmy for it in 1954. Meadows turned out to be smart in another way too, and this decision shaped the rest of her life. On the advice of her brother Edward, who was a lawyer, she insisted that her CBS contract include a clause guaranteeing she would be paid if the episodes were ever shown again. At that time, reruns were barely understood as a real source of money. Her brother believed television would one day make serious profits by replaying old shows, and he was right, far beyond what anyone expected. The Honeymooners has stayed in circulation almost without interruption since 1956. Meadows is widely said to have been the only member of the main cast to receive residuals from those reruns. Over time, that music brought her far more money than her original salary. Today, that kind of clause feels normal. Back then, it was a rare act of music foresight. The audience responded to Alice so deeply that some people forgot she was fictional. Viewers mailed me curtains, pot holders, irons, and other household items because they wanted the Creighton apartment to feel less bleak. One person even mailed her a dime so she could buy a curtain rod. That small gesture says a lot about how real the show felt to people sitting at home. Money behind the scenes told another story. As Gleason's CBS music contract approached its end, the network and Buick offered him a massive new deal worth about $11 million for 78 filmed episodes over 2 seasons with an option for one more. It was described at the time as the biggest contract television had seen. Yet that number came with a condition. Gleason had to pay the production costs himself, including the salaries of his cast. Those salaries reveal a lot. Art Carney earned around $3,500 a week. Audrey Meadows earned about $2,000. Joyce Randolph earned about $500. That was still solid money in 1955 when the average American family made around $4,400 in a whole year. But Randolph's pay was far below that of the men around her. She also had no residual clause, which meant she received nothing from reruns of the classic 39. Years later, she began earning royalties only when the so-called lost episodes were found and released. Working conditions were just as unusual as the contracts. Jackie Gleason hated rehearsing. He believed too much rehearsal drained comedy of its life. He also liked spending afternoons at Toots's Shores instead of running lines, and both facts, music, seemed to have shaped his method. He often did only a single walkthrough, sometimes as late as the day before filming, because he wanted everyone, including the camera crew, to hear the jokes fresh when the show was done. The rest of the cast, music, did not share his confidence. So Carney, Meadows, and Randolph rehearsed privately and read Ralph's lines to each other so they would be ready. The schedule was tight. A new script might be read late in the week, and most of the real work was packed into show day. The filming happened on Saturday nights at 8, and by around 9, Gleason was often already on his way out to Toots Shores, or the 21 Club. Within the larger contract, his own share worked out to around $65,000 per episode, though that money still had to cover the full production. Because Gleason disliked rehearsal, he sometimes forgot his place. The cast had a quiet way to handle that. If Ralph patted his stomach during a scene, it meant, music, Gleason had lost track, and the others needed to keep talking until he found his way back. Meadows also became skilled at guiding him through scenes without making it obvious. A look, a hand on her hip, or a glance toward the refrigerator could push him toward the mark or the next moment. At times, Alice's music, sharp expressions were doing double duty. They were part of the character, but they were also a way of steering the scene. Gleason's control over the show went far beyond that. He decided what would be rehearsed, shaped the direction, and had such a forceful presence that few people felt comfortable challenging him. Joyce Randolph later said that you did not casually talk to Jackie or ask him for favors. That included asking for more material. Still, for all his pride and distance, he was generous in one important way. He openly said that, music, art Carney was central to the success of the Honeymooners. Gleason believed he could perform with almost any Alice or Trixie, but not without Carney. He knew what Norton brought to the show, and he said so. That loose style also meant mistakes stayed in the finished episodes, and many of those mistakes became part of the charm. In Better Living Through TV, when Ralph and Norton try to do a commercial for the handy housewife helper, the prop breaks apart during the scene and they just keep going. In The Man from Space, a knob falls off Ralph's homemade costume, so Gleason quickly turns it into part of the joke and calls it his denaturalizer. Elsewhere, walls came loose, popcorn burst, and lines went sideways. Carney's funny habit of signing his name with a long, elaborate flourish was also spontaneous. He later said it came from watching his father, music, sign report cards. The show felt alive because those accidents were allowed to breathe instead of being polished away. Even outside the Honeymooners, Jackie Gleason was, music, a strange and fascinating figure. Orson Welles is often credited with giving him the nickname The Great One, and Gleason lived in a way that made the title feel larger than life. He was a comedian, actor, writer, and composer. His easy-listening album, Music for Lovers Only, spent an astonishing 153 weeks in the Billboard Top 10. Yet, behind the swagger, he carried old wounds from his Brooklyn childhood, and those wounds stayed with him. Biographers have written about a man who mixed talent with loneliness, appetite, ego, and a steady pull toward self-destruction. Then there was the side of him that sounded almost unreal. Gleason had a deep interest in the paranormal, especially UFOs. He built a personal library of around 1,700 books on parapsychology and the occult. And that collection was later donated to the University of Miami. He even had a spaceship-shaped house built near Peekskill, New York, and called the main part the mother ship. His fascination, music, went so far that it became tangled with politics and rumor. Gleason was friendly with Richard Nixon, engulfed with him, and from that friendship came one of the strangest stories attached to any major television star. According to a long-running legend, Nixon once took Gleason to a military base in Florida in the early 1970s and secretly showed him the bodies of dead aliens. The story has never been verified. Music, it survives through second-hand accounts and family memories. And it sits in music, that strange area where proof is missing, yet the tale refuses to die. In a way, that feels fitting. Music, Gleason himself seemed built to leave behind stories that people could never fully pin down. What people usually mean by that so-called scene is not one single moment at all. It is the whole pattern the show kept returning to. There was no forbidden episode, no secret order from the network, and no scene ripped out by censors. What stayed in people's minds was Ralph Creighton's habit of exploding in anger, waving a fist, and telling Alice he would send her to the moon or land one right in the kisser. Back in 1955, those lines made a studio audience of 1,000 people roar with laughter. The joke worked because everyone in the room understood the threat was empty. Ralph never hit Alice. The real comic pull came from the fact that his anger always collapsed in front of her calm strength. Alice saw straight through him. She answered back, stood her ground, and kept control of the room until Ralph lost all his force, stumbled into nervous words, and finally gave in with affection and praise. Again and again, the show let Alice come out smarter, music, steadier, and stronger. At times it even stepped into ideas that felt bold for the period, including a woman's right to work in her, music, place inside the marriage. Still, comedy changes as the years move on. What once played as harmless bluster now lands very differently. A man repeatedly threatening to hit his wife no longer feels light to modern viewers. It feels ugly. It feels serious. That is why so many people talk about the show as if something about it must have been banned. The feeling comes from a real discomfort. Even if the history behind it is different, no authority shut down the Honeymooners. The culture changed. The audience changed. And with that change, the line that once brought laughter began to make people pull back instead. That tension is part of music, what keeps the show so fascinating. Even in its own time, it already stood apart. By 1955, television had mostly drifted toward pleasant suburban families, living in neat homes where money problems hardly seemed to exist. Music, viewers were being invited into clean living rooms, trimmed lawns, and easy lessons. The Honeymooners took the opposite path. It stayed in the city. It stayed with working-class people. It stayed inside a cramped apartment where money was tight, nerves were worn thin, and marriage felt full, music, of strain as well as love. That rough honesty gave the show its power. It also gave music it its edge. The threats were the harshest part of that world, and the writers depended on the audience, believing Ralph was all noise, while the real balance of power belonged to Alice. Audrey Meadows later spent years saying the show, and Jackie Gleason himself held more warmth than critics, music, allowed. That defense has stayed alive because the show keeps inviting the same question every new decade. How much softness can an audience still see inside a joke that no longer feels safe? There's another reason the series feels both complete and strangely unfinished. Most people know the famous 39 filmed episodes, but that is only part of the story. Between 1951 and 1957, more than 100 additional Honeymooners sketches appeared on variety television, and some of them ran much longer than a standard half hour. There were even 2 sketches on The Ed Sullivan Show. For years, Jackie Gleason kept the original kinescopes locked away in a private vault, so the music public barely saw them. Then, starting in the middle of the 1980s, those recordings slowly began to reappear under the title The Lost Episodes. More material kept surfacing over time, and even a major 60th anniversary collection in 2011 was still bringing back performances unseen for decades, including 8 musical episodes built around a trip to Europe. Those releases also brought attention to early performances by Per Kelton, music, as Alice and Elaine Stretch as Trixie. In a twist that feels almost too fitting for this story, music, the rediscovery and sale of those sketches also finally brought royalties to Joyce Randolph, who had received nothing from the well-known 39. When the film version of The Honeymooners premiered in October 1955, it arrived as a real success. For a while, it ranked second in the country behind only I Love Lucy, which was the giant of television comedy. Gleason looked untouchable on Saturday night. Then the ground shifted. NBC moved the Perry Como show into the same Saturday evening slot and the competition hit hard. In February 1956, music, The Honeymooners itself moved to an 8 p.m. Eastern start and more viewers began choosing Como's easygoing variety hour over the pressure cooker of the Cretons' apartment. The contrast was clear. Perry Co offered music, calm, and comfort. The Honeymooners gave people heat, frustration, and raised voices in a tenement, music, kitchen. In a country enjoying post-war prosperity, the softer choice began to pull ahead. By September 1956, the show had fallen from number 2 to number 19 in the Nielsen ratings, and cancellation was already in the air. Gleason never waited for that moment to arrive. He ended the filmed series himself. In his view, the writers had already taken the half-hour format, music, as far as it could go. The ideas were thinning out and he had no interest in keeping the show alive by letting the quality slip. He said more than once that he cared too much about the series to cheapen it. The writing staff had felt the pressure, too. Many of them preferred the older live sketches, which often stretched past 30 minutes and had more room to breathe. The tight structure that made the filmed episodes so sharp also felt restrictive. For Gleason, that discipline had started to feel limiting. So, the huge Buick deal that had been built around 78 filmed episodes never reached its full length. Gleason and CBS agreed to stop after one season. The 39th and final original episode aired on September 22, 1956. After that, he sold the films and their syndication rights to CBS for about $1.5 million. That deal would matter for years, especially because of how the residuals were arranged. Audrey Meadows benefited from that foresight, music, in a lasting way, while others did not. Even then, the story, music, still did not end. Just 1 week after the Honeymooners left the air, Gleason brought back his live variety, music, show from CBS Studio 50 on September 29, 1956, music, and the Creightons came right back with him as sketches inside the larger program. During the 1956, music, to 1957 season, the writers regained their freedom to go long, and the Creightons and Nortons were sent into a musical trip to Europe. At the end of that season, Art Carney left and Gleason mostly set the characters aside until he revived them in the 1960s on the Jackie Gleason American Scene magazine. Those later versions often appeared on videotape. And when Audrey Meadows was unavailable, Sheila McRae stepped in as Alice. Gleason kept returning to the Creightons in occasional specials into the late 1970s.